Hi, I'm Jim Ward of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 10 in our History Bite series. Today we will be discussing Apollo 11 and the first men to step foot on the moon. After World War II came to an end, the Cold War began, which pitted the United States versus the Soviet Union. By the mid 1950s, the US Soviet Cold War had worked its way into the fabric of everyday life in both countries. Fueled by the arms race and the growing threat of nuclear weapons, wide ranging espionage and counter espionage between the two countries, war in Korea, and a clash of words and ideas carried out in the media. These tensions would continue throughout the space race, exacerbated by such events as the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and the outbreak of war in Southeast Asia. Space exploration served as another dramatic arena for Cold War competition. On October 4th, 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, Russian for Traveler, the world's first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. Sputnik's launch came as a surprise and not a pleasant one to most Americans. In the United States, space was seen as the next frontier, a logical extension of the grand American tradition of exploration, and it was crucial not to lose too much ground to the Soviets. In addition, this demonstration of the overwhelming power of the R 7 missile, seemingly capable of delivering a nuclear warhead into U.S. airspace, made gathering intelligence about Soviet military activities particularly urgent. In 1958, the U.S. launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, designed by the U.S. Army under the direction of rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. That same year, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed a public order creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, a federal agency dedicated to space exploration. In 1959, the Soviet space program took another step forward with the launch of Luna 2, the first space probe to hit the moon. In April 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit Earth, traveling in the capsule like spacecraft Vostok 1. For the U.S. effort to send a man into space, dubbed Project Mercury, NASA engineers designed a smaller, cone shaped capsule far lighter than Vostok. They tested the spacecraft with chimpanzees and held a final test flight in March 1961 before the Soviets were able to pull ahead with Gagarin's launch. On May 5th, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space, though not in orbit. President John F. Kennedy made the bold public claim that the U.S. would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade when he spoke before Congress on May 25, 1961. At Rice University in September of 1962, he declared, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." The goal was set, and NASA responded to Soviet accomplishments with their own. In February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Following the achievements of the crewed Mercury and Gemini programs, NASA engineers embarked on a series of missions to place human footprints on the moon with the Apollo program. The program got off to a horrific start on January 27, 1967, when all three astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, in the Apollo 1 capsule were killed during a launch rehearsal test that sparked a huge fire. But that catastrophic failure generated extensive redesigns of the spacecraft and a commitment to ensuring that the crew did not die in vain. Just over a year later, on October 11, 1968, NASA launched its first Apollo astronauts into space aboard a Saturn I rocket for the 11-day Apollo 7 mission. This was followed 2 months later by Apollo 8, which sent a crew around the moon and back to Earth. As one of the most turbulent, tragic years in American history drew to a close, millions around the world were watching and listening as the Apollo 8 astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, became the first humans to orbit another world. As their command module floated above the lunar surface, the astronauts beamed back images of the moon and Earth and took turns reading from the book of Genesis. The mission was also famous for this iconic Earthrise image snapped by Anders, which would give humankind a new perspective on their home planet. Anders has said that despite all the training and preparation for an exploration of the moon, the astronauts ended up discovering Earth. They closed with a wish for everyone on the good Earth. The Apollo 8 mission was an important testing ground for the spacecraft systems and navigation techniques that NASA had developed for approaching and orbiting the moon. These systems and techniques made the future lunar landing possible. Meanwhile, the Soviets were continuing to build up their spaceflight capabilities, but by the time of Apollo 8, repeated disasters had caused their moon program to lose momentum. In 1969, NASA launched Apollo 9, which conducted critical tests of its lunar module in Earth orbit, and Apollo 10, which all but landed on the moon, bringing its crew within a few miles of the lunar surface. The stage was set for Apollo 11 in July 1969. Apollo 11 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center at 9:32 a.m. on July 16th. Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module pilot Buzz Aldrin were aboard. 3 days later, the crew entered lunar orbit, and on July 20th, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin headed into the Lunar Module, codenamed Eagle, and began their descent toward the lunar surface, while Collins orbited in the Command Module, Columbia. When it came time to set Eagle down in the Sea of Tranquility, Armstrong improvised, manually piloting the ship past an area littered with boulders. During the final seconds of descent, Eagle's computer was sounding alarms. It turned out to be a simple case of the computer trying to do too many things at once, but as Aldrin will later point out, quote, "Unfortunately, it came up when we did not want to be trying to solve these particular problems," end quote. When the lunar module lands at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time, only 30 seconds of fuel remained. Armstrong radioed, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Mission Control erupts in celebration as the tension breaks, and a controller tells the crew, "You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." At 10:56 p.m., Neil Armstrong climbs down the ladder of the LEM and steps off the spacecraft. He is the first human being to ever step foot on the surface of the moon. He then proclaims, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Aldrin joined him shortly and offered a simple but powerful description of the lunar surface: magnificent desolation. They explored the surface for 2.5 hours, collecting samples and taking photographs. In what he described as the most historic phone call ever made from the White House, President Richard Nixon spoke to astronauts Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin. The astronauts left behind an American flag, a patch honoring the fallen Apollo 1 crew, and a plaque on one of Eagle's legs. It reads, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Armstrong and Aldrin blasted off and docked with Collins in Columbia. Collins later said that for the first time, he really felt that they were going to carry this thing off. The crew splashed down off Hawaii on July 24th. Kennedy's challenge had been met, men from Earth walked on the moon, and returned safely home. There would be 6 more missions to land men on the moon in the next 3 years, including the successful failure Apollo 13. The last time a human being has walked on the moon was 1972. By landing on the moon, the United States effectively won the space race that had begun with Sputnik's launch in 1957. For their part, the Soviets made 4 failed attempts to launch a lunar landing craft between 1969 and 1972, including a spectacular launch pad explosion in July 1969. From beginning to end, the American public's attention was captivated by the space race, and the various developments by the Soviet and U.S. space programs were heavily covered in the national media. This frenzy of interest was further encouraged by the new medium of television. Astronauts came to be seen as the ultimate American heroes, and earthbound men and women seemed to enjoy living vicariously through them. With the conclusion of the space race, U.S. government interest in lunar missions waned after the early 1970s. In 1975, the joint Apollo-Soyuz mission sent 3 U.S. astronauts into space aboard an Apollo spacecraft that docked in orbit with a Soviet-made Soyuz vehicle. When the commanders of the two crafts officially greeted each other, their handshake in space served to symbolize the gradual improvement of U.S.-Soviet relations in the late Cold War era. Thank you everyone for joining me for today's episode, and if you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and I'll see you all next time.